What do you do when it seems like the bad guys keep on winning? Hi, I'm Pastor Allen, and welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. As always, our goal is to help you deepen your understanding of the Bible, to help you develop as a follower of Jesus, and to help you discover the unique place God has for you in His amazing plan. Now, before we go any further, please give this video a like and share it with your friends. That's the best way we have to invite more people into this study. Also, be sure to subscribe or sign up for notifications so you won't miss any of our future studies. And if this is your first time to join us, please leave us a comment to let us know where you're joining us from. The big question we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks is, how do we keep the light of faith burning even when we're surrounded by the darkness of doubt? One of the things that contributes to doubt is the struggle between reconciling our faith in God with the reality of evil and injustice. We've been wrestling with these questions with a little help from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, who ministered in the late 7th century BC. Habakkuk lived during a time when his home nation of Judah was in danger of being swept up in conflicts between its larger neighbors. But the thing that really concerned Habakkuk was the idolatry, immorality, and injustice he saw being practiced among his very own people. If God was real, why wasn't he doing something about the corruption and evil in Judah? Well, God answered Habakkuk and informed the prophet that, in fact, he was aware of what was happening in Judah and that he already had set a plan in motion to deal with it. In fact, God told Habakkuk he intended to send one of those powerful neighbors, the Babylonians, to invade Judah and to ravage its cities as a form of judgment against his people's sins. And if you think that sounds a little harsh, just remember, God had been trying to get his people's attention for generations, and they had failed to respond to more gentle measures. So this was kind of a last-ditch attempt to get them to fly right. Now, this raised another disturbing question in Habakkuk's mind. How could a holy God use such an unholy people like the Babylonians to carry out his plans? The answer that God gave to Habakkuk basically boils down to trust. We have to trust in God's character and God's faithfulness. And as part of that trust, we have to remember that God is just. So God inevitably will deal with injustice. And God will deal with that injustice in his own time, which may not always match our limited time frames. And God will deal with that injustice in his own manner, which may not always align with our perspective. Let me put it to you this way. Imagine a man comes at you with a sharp knife and he begins to cut into your abdomen. Well, that sounds kind of evil, doesn't it? But what if I told you the man was a surgeon, the knife was a scalpel, and he was cutting into your abdomen to remove a deadly tumor that was growing inside of you? Well, that kind of changes things, doesn't it? Think of Babylon as the sharp knife that the great physician was using to remove a deadly defect from his chosen people. Sometimes from our limited perspective, God's actions may look ominous or a little scary. But when we look through eyes of faith, we understand that God's ultimate objective is our good. Now that brings us to another question. It's not really a question Habakkuk asked explicitly, but he does kind of provide an answer. So he must have had this in mind. Here it is. What are God's people to do when it looks like the bad guys keep on winning? I mean, consider Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was the rising power in the region, eclipsing the older powers of Assyria and Egypt. And it seemed like everything was going Babylon's way. The Babylonians kept getting richer and more powerful. However, the Babylons were growing at the expense of their neighbors, many of whom they bullied, manipulated, or just outright destroyed. So how should God's people respond in the face of injustice like that? Well, obviously, we speak out against injustice when we can, and we intervene when we must. But what if we're powerless to put a stop to the predations of an oppressor? What then? Well, in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 6 through 20, Habakkuk again reminds us that God is still at work, though his manner of dealing with injustice and evil may work on a different time frame and take a different form from what we would do if we could intervene. 5 times in 13 verses, Habakkuk directs the word woe against the Babylonians. Actually, this is a translation of the Hebrew word hoy, which can have a lot of different meanings, but it usually is associated with lament or judgment. Somebody's actually done the math, and hoy reportedly appears about 53 times in the Old Testament. 8 of those times it's used as part of a funeral oration. 4 times it's used as an exclamation, just to draw attention to the speaker. The other 41 times, and nearly always when it's used by one of the prophets, it's used to warn of God's impending judgment against a people or nation. In other words, for a prophet of God to pronounce woe over you is not a good thing. Each of those 5 pronouncements of woe over Babylon in Habakkuk chapter 2 tends to follow a pattern. After the actual pronouncement of woe, the prophet issues a threat of judgment coming from God, along with the reason the judgment is being sent. See if you can notice that pattern as we work our way through these verses. First, we see in verses 6 through 8 that God judges those who enrich themselves by taking advantage of others. In verses 6 through 8, we read, "Will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, 'Woe to him who increases what is not his'? And how long? And makes himself rich with loans. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you have looted many nations. All the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and to its inhabitants." Now remember this universal truth. What goes around, comes around. All of these refers to all the nations that the Babylonians had oppressed in their rise to power. The him whom the nations will taunt refers to the Babylonian Empire. Habakkuk actually foresaw a time when the nations that Babylon had oppressed would turn the tables on the Babylonians. The Babylonians had used their influence, intimidation, and threats of violence to pressure their neighbors into unfavorable treaties and business contracts. At times, the Babylonians had actually altered the terms of those treaties unilaterally, or they just simply ignored the terms. I mean, after all, who in their right mind would complain to the Babylonians? However, according to the Lord, in taking advantage of their neighbors, the Babylonians were running up a tab that would eventually come due. And the day would come when the oppressed would gang up on the oppressor and turn the tables. What happens to the bully when his victims decide to join forces? One day, the nations that Babylon had bullied would laugh at how far the Babylonians had fallen. The second thing we see in this speech, God judges those who raise themselves up by tearing others down. In verses 9 through 11, we read, "Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples. And so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework." The Babylonians had used their influence and power to build for themselves what they thought was an unassailable position. Literally, they built secure, fortified cities. Figuratively, they built a reputation that would scare off just about any challenger. However, because Babylon built that security on threats and intimidation, it rested on an unstable foundation that could not be maintained. One day, those cities would sit empty, and the silent ruins would serve as a testimony to Babylon's fall. We also see in this passage that God judges those who secure their own position through acts of violence against others. In verses 12 through 14, Habakkuk writes, "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." The Babylonians were guilty of building their empire through bloodshed, slaughtering enemy armies in battle, butchering innocent civilians as they plundered captured cities, ruthlessly making an example of anyone who tried to stand against them, treating the lives of subjugated peoples as cheap and expendable. However, the prohibition of shedding innocent blood was one of the strongest commandments and is one of the strongest commandments ever given by the God who created this world. According to Genesis 9, verse 6, back in the days of Noah, God had said, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. So God there shows the value he places on an individual human life by the sanction he requires for violating that life. In Numbers 35, verses 30 through 31, God had instructed his people, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who's guilty of death, for he shall be put to death. Again, there we see the seriousness of the commission of murder by the penalty that is attached to remedy that. According to God, in Numbers 35 through 33, bloodshed polluted a land in such a way that it could only be cleansed by the execution of the murderer. Now, the Babylonians believed that they were powerful enough to take lives with impunity, put them on a collision course with the real power of the universe. Here in this passage, Habakkuk calls God the Lord of hosts. This very special name that's used throughout the Old Testament emphasizes God's position as the one who commanded the armies of heaven. The Babylonians believed they were powerful, but compared to God, they were like a rowboat against a battleship. The Babylonians wanted to make a name for themselves, but the Lord of heaven's armies intended to fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory. The Hebrew word translated there as knowledge implies a personal knowledge. In other words, a relationship. God's desire was for everyone to have the opportunity to come to know him personally as he truly is. If the Babylonians' quest for power stood in the way of that objective, then they would be swept aside. And by taking innocent life, they were preventing people from coming to that personal knowledge of God. That's something God took very, very seriously. Fourthly, we see that God judges those who seek to control others through manipulation, intimidation, and exploitation. In verses 15 through 17, we read, woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so that as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourselves drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all its inhabitants. Now, the Babylonians were infamous for their drinking parties, which often degenerated into drunken orgies. Here, Habakkuk uses that imagery figuratively to describe the way the Babylonians used their influence to seduce their neighbors. Eventually, those who fell under the Babylonian spell would be taken advantage of and humiliated, like Lebanon, which is mentioned there. Apparently, the Babylonians had stripped some of Lebanon's forests that were famous for their hardwoods. Because of the way the Babylonians took advantage of their neighbors, God threatened to make them drink of his cup, a cup filled not with wine, but with wrath, a cup of judgment. Ironically, when the city of Babylon eventually fell to the Medes and the Persians about 70 years later, the prophet Daniel reports that the Babylonian king was doing what else? Hosting a drinking party. You can read the story in Daniel chapter 5. And then finally, God judges those who trust in their own devices instead of trusting in the Lord. In verses 18 through 20, Habakkuk writes, what profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, the teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, or to a mute stone, arise. And that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath at all inside it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. The Babylonians took a lot of pride in their magnificent idols. Now, people may have made idols to represent their gods for millennia. People today may not make literal idols to bow down and worship, but they still bow down to things like power, popularity, possessions, and the pursuit of pleasure. The thing about idols is that whatever you can make with your own hands is something you can control or manipulate. However, no one can control the living God, who has revealed himself through the Bible. Empires will come and empires will fall. But in the end, all the world will realize that God is real and he is on his throne, ruling over his creation to fulfill his own divine plans. Habakkuk's words were about the Babylonians, but remember, the prophet was actually speaking to his own people, the residents of Judah. So these words also have application to them and to all the other nations of the world, including people like us. So while these words were a warning to the Babylonians, they're also a warning to all of us as well, to anyone who would be tempted to build up themselves at the expense of others. These words are also intended as a comfort to those who are being oppressed and for those who are upset to see other people oppressed. So how should God's people respond when it seems like the bad guys keep on winning? Well, we speak out where we can, we intervene where we must, but ultimately we keep trusting in the Lord and in his plan. We have to trust that he sees, that he has a plan, and in the end, he's going to bring about true justice. The Lord is still on his throne. Now, he may not always work in the way we expect or on the same schedule that we would work on, but God is still on the throne, and in the end, his will be done. Why can we trust in the Lord? Well, in our next session, we're going to see what Habakkuk has to say about that. I hope you can join us for that. In the meantime, if you want to know more about what it means to have a personal relationship with God, please reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net or post a question in the comments. Until next time, keep on walking in faith.